"Get away from that engine room, you filthy thing." Desmond Carrick snarled at the maid, with no idea that the woman he had just chased off was about to save his $300 million tower from blowing apart and shatter every prejudice he had carried his whole life. Milky white vapor hissed out from a vent beneath the basement of the Carrick complex, screaming like a cornered animal. The chief engineer backed away, the color drained from his face, stammering that the system had locked itself down, and no one could reach the core anymore. The staff scattered to either side. On the control panel, a warning blinked a furious red. 19 minutes. In the middle of the chaos, a woman in a faded cleaning uniform stepped forward, her calloused hands raised to chest height. She said the secondary cooling loop had cracked, that the pressure was building in the wrong direction, and that she could fix it. Desmond's finger froze over the button to call security. How could a cleaning woman know about a system his own chief engineer couldn't even name correctly? What kind of mind was hiding beneath that worn-out uniform? And if she was truly that brilliant, why was she down here scrubbing his floors? In the next 19 minutes, everything Desmond Carrick believed about power, about the worth of a human being, and about who deserved to be looked down upon, would collapse completely. If you're curious who that woman really is, hit like and share this story with someone who needs to hear it. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you never miss a moment of justice about to unfold. Desmond Carrick wasn't used to having an order ignored by someone beneath him. He jerked his chin toward the two security guards standing nearby, his voice cold as steel, and told them to get this woman out of the basement immediately, before she caused any more trouble. But Maya didn't step back. She took one more step toward the control panel, her eyes never leaving the column of steam spraying from the air vent, and said that if he let them drag her away now, then in less than 20 minutes the entire tower would be nothing but a heap of broken brick. Those words made the two security men freeze. They glanced at their boss, waiting for his command. Maya went on, each word clear and precise, as if she were reading from a blueprint she knew by heart, saying that the steam wasn't pure white but tinted greenish-gray at the base, and that was a sign the coolant was leaking through a small crack and vaporizing when it met the hot core. She said the pressure in the secondary loop was being forced backward into the central chamber, instead of escaping through the relief valve, and that was exactly why his automatic lock system was useless, because it had been programmed to block a forward flow, not a reverse one. The chief engineer, who had been standing pale-faced beside them all this time, suddenly jerked his head up. He opened his mouth to argue, but no words came out, because what the woman in the janitorial uniform had just said was so accurate that he had never heard anyone outside the original design team describe it that way. Desmond noticed the change on his engineer's face, and that was the first thing that made him hesitate. He turned to the man and asked whether anything she said had any basis. The engineer swallowed hard, then admitted that the reverse flow structure was a theoretical flaw once mentioned in the manufacturer's confidential documents, a flaw even he had only heard about in passing and had never seen with his own eyes. The air in the basement grew heavy. Maya pointed at the warning screen, where the numbers were counting down, and said that when the clock reached 9 minutes, the pressure would exceed the tolerance of the steel casing, and by then no one in this room would make it to the elevator in time. She added that she didn't need him to believe her. She only needed him to give her 30 seconds to prove it, and if she was wrong, he could throw her in prison for trespassing in a technical area. A billionaire used to giving orders, a kingpin used to making others lower their heads, stood for the first time before a choice that money and power couldn't solve. He looked at the woman in front of him, at her faded uniform, her shoes worn down at the heels, her 2 hands calloused from scrubbing and cleaning, then looked over at the trembling engineer, with the expensive degree hanging on his office wall. Every instinct forged in the underground world told him never to place the power of life and death in the hands of a stranger. But there was something in this woman's eyes, an absolute calm, in the middle of everyone else's panic, that made him believe she wasn't guessing. The number on the screen dropped to 16 minutes. Desmond clenched his teeth, signaled for the security men to step back, and said only one sentence to her, that if this tower exploded, she would be the first to explode with it. Maya nodded, without a trace of fear, and answered that she was already used to being placed in the most dangerous spot. She took off her uniform jacket, draped it over the railing, rolled up her sleeves, and walked straight toward the steel door leading into the core chamber. The crowd behind her held its breath. The chief engineer stammered and asked what she planned to do when she didn't have a single specialized tool in her hands. Maya didn't look back. She only said that sometimes the thing that could save an entire building wasn't inside an expensive toolbox, but inside the mind of someone who knew what she was doing. And in that moment, Desmond Carrick, the man the whole city treated with caution, realized he had just placed the fate of $300 million and the lives of dozens of people into the hands of someone he had called a ragged nobody only 5 minutes earlier. The steel door leading into the core chamber was blazing hot, like the mouth of a furnace, and the gray-green vapor blew straight into Maya's face the moment she crossed the threshold. She had no mask, no heat-resistant gloves, no specialized valve kit that an entire technical crew should have been carrying. But she had something more important than all of that. She knew exactly what she needed to find. Maya knelt beneath the cluster of pipes and ran her hand along the metal casing, which was trembling in waves under the pressure, until her fingers stopped at a damp spot no bigger than the tip of a pencil. The crack was exactly where she had guessed it would be, right at the joint between the secondary cooling loop and the central chamber. A hairline fracture so fine the naked eye could barely see it, yet wide enough for coolant to seep out and force the pressure in the wrong direction. She looked back toward the door and shouted for the chief engineer to find her anything with graphite in it. A drafting pencil, a graphite stick, anything at all. The man stood frozen, unable to understand. But Desmond, from behind him, snatched the pencil case off the control table and threw it straight into her hand. Maya snapped the pencil in two, pulled out the graphite core inside, gently crushed the tip into fine powder, then pressed it into the mouth of the crack. As she worked, she explained quickly, almost as if speaking only to herself, that the graphite particles would slip into the gap and form a heat-conducting cushion, enough to keep the coolant from continuing to leak for a few precious minutes. But graphite alone wasn't enough. It was only the foundation. She called out again, asking whether anyone had emergency sealant, the kind used for pressure pipes, and a maintenance worker fumbled through his tool bag before handing her a small tube of adhesive. Maya squeezed out just enough, spread it over the graphite powder, then used her own bare fingers to press the mixture tightly into the crack, even as the heat lashed against her skin and flesh. She knew something no one else in that room understood, that the graphite particles and the polymer layer in the sealant would bond together into a molecular link far stronger than either material on its own, a trick she had once figured out during long nights when she had nothing but her own mind to keep her company. Outside, the numbers on the screen kept falling without mercy. 7 minutes, then 6 minutes, and every pulse of the countdown felt like a hand tightening around the throats of everyone standing breathless on the other side of the door. Desmond stood right at the threshold, for the first time in his life unable to order time to slow down, able only to watch the woman inside the core chamber work with her bare hands, as if the entire world beyond that room no longer existed. Maya held the patch firmly in place, silently counting in her head so the sealant would have time to harden, then reached toward the release valve cluster she had been watching all along. She turned the valve in a direction no engineer would have thought to try, opening a reverse escape path to relieve the pressure that had been forced the wrong way, guiding the flow back onto the course it should have followed from the start. For one long, suffocating moment, nothing changed. The column of vapor still sprayed, the numbers still flickered, and Maya remained kneeling there with both hands pressed against the burning metal. Then the piercing hiss began to soften. The gray-green vapor thinned, faded, and faded again, until only a few fragile strands dissolved into the air. On the control panel, the pressure column that had been standing upright in a furious red slowly began to drop, slipping past the danger line before settling quietly into the safe zone. The countdown stopped at 3 minutes, frozen in place as if it too had just breathed out in relief. The entire basement sank into a strange silence, the silence of people who had just witnessed something their reason told them should have been impossible. Maya braced a hand against the wall and stood, staggered out of the core chamber, drenched in sweat, both palms reddened from the heat, and said nothing. And Desmond Carrick stood there, staring at the woman who had just saved his entire fortune and his life with a scrap of pencil graphite. And for the first time in many years, that powerful man couldn't find a single word to say. When everything had settled and the crowd began to scatter with murmured whispers and restless speculation, Maya didn't stay behind to receive the attention that anyone else surely would have craved in that situation. She took back the uniform jacket draped over the railing, slipped it on, pulled the cleaning cart out from the corner of the wall where she had left it when she ran over, and quietly pushed it toward the staff elevator, as if what had just happened was nothing more than a brief detour in the middle of her workday. A few employees still lingered, watching her with confused eyes. Someone seemed about to ask if she was all right, but she only lowered her head to avoid them and walked faster. To Maya, Attention had never brought anything good. It only dragged along questions she didn't want to answer, and prying eyes she had learned to fear. She returned to the 12th floor according to her schedule, put on her rubber gloves, wiped the mirrors in the hallway, replaced the towels in the lounges, and let her still burning hands sink into work so familiar she no longer had to think about it. None of the wealthy guests gliding past her in the corridor knew that the woman in the faded uniform, kneeling to scrub a stain beneath their feet, had just kept the entire tower from turning into ash, and that was exactly what she wanted. Meanwhile, more than 10 floors below, in the penthouse office where the whole city spread out beneath panes of glass stretching from floor to ceiling, Desmond Carrick stood with his back to his most loyal man, his hands clasped behind him, his eyes lowered to the tiny stream of people moving along the streets below. He hadn't spoken a single word of thanks to that woman, not because he didn't realize he owed her, but because gratitude was foreign to a man accustomed to standing in a place where everyone else owed him. But one question had been drilling through his mind ever since the vapor finally died away, a question that the instincts tempered in the underground world wouldn't allow him to ignore. He turned back, called the name Roland Pike, the right-hand man still standing silently at his side awaiting orders, and told him to find out everything about the housekeeper from earlier. He said he wanted to know her real name, where she came from, what she had done before she ever held a cleaning rag, and most importantly, why someone who could recite the technical structure of a classified system as easily as a multiplication table was scrubbing floors in his hotel for a wage barely enough to survive from one day to the next. Roland Pike nodded, but for one very brief instant, a strange expression passed across his face. One Desmond failed to notice. A tension almost too subtle to see when that woman was mentioned. Desmond added that he didn't like things he couldn't understand, and a person who didn't match the shell she wore was exactly the kind of thing that cost him sleep. In his world, an unsolved mystery was always a potential threat, and he had survived long enough to know that those who hid themselves the best were usually the ones carrying the most stories. He ordered Roland to watch her discreetly, not to let her know, not to bother her, only to observe and report. He wanted to see how she lived once she left this tower, where she went after her shift, and whether anyone else was standing behind her. Roland answered with a bow and withdrew, while Desmond turned back to the glass window, his gaze fixed on the staff exit at the corner of the street below, waiting for the small figure in the faded uniform to appear. An invisible distance had been drawn between two people, one the master of an underground empire standing at the top of the building, the other a nameless woman wiping floors somewhere above him, and neither of them yet knew that the thread of fate just tied between them would pull them toward each other in a way no one could have foreseen. The next morning, when Carrick Tower had returned to its ordinary rhythm, and not a single guest knew about the disaster that had nearly happened beneath their feet, Desmond summoned his private technical team down to the basement to inspect the entire cooling system again. He wasn't the kind of man who believed in coincidence, and the more he thought about what had happened, the more he sensed that something was wrong, buried deep beneath the surface of what looked like an ordinary technical accident. The tower's cooling system had been installed less than 2 years earlier, maintained on the strictest possible schedule, and designed with so many layers of backup that a natural crack forming at the weakest possible point, at the most sensitive possible moment, was something his instincts refused to accept. The technical team worked all morning, dismantling the cluster of pipes Maya had patched with her bare hands, and when they placed the crack under magnification, the team leader turned pale and reported to Desmond the very thing he had already feared in silence. That fracture hadn't been caused by metal fatigue or by heat building up over time. Its edges were too sharp, too straight, too even, carrying the marks of a precise cutting tool guided by a hand that knew exactly what it was doing. Someone had deliberately created that crack, placed it in the exact position where the pressure would be forced backward instead of escaping, and calculated it so the building's automatic lock system would become useless. In other words, this wasn't an accident. It was an act of sabotage, planned with meticulous care by someone who understood the system down to its roots. Desmond stood silent before the dismantled pipes, and in his mind, the pieces began fitting together into a picture that made his blood run cold. The explosion, if it had happened, wouldn't just have burned down a building. It would have taken place exactly 3 days before he signed the largest deal of his career, the Southern Container Port merger he had been quietly building for 2 full years. A disaster at his own headquarters, with dozens of lives lost and an enormous amount of damage, would have destroyed every shred of trust his partners had in him, forced them to withdraw, and pushed the entire deal into the hands of whoever was waiting in the dark to gather up what remained. This wasn't a strike aimed at the tower. It was a strike aimed directly at his empire, calculated to kill him in terms of power without leaving behind a single fingerprint. The more Desmond thought about it, the more clearly he saw a truth that forced him to grip the railing just to keep himself calm. If the woman in the faded uniform hadn't happened to pass through the basement at that exact moment, by now he would have lost everything. The empire he had spent so many years building would have collapsed, and the person behind it all would have won without anyone ever knowing. A nameless housekeeper, someone he had shouted at only yesterday, as if driving away an animal, had accidentally crushed a trap that the most sophisticated minds in the underworld had set to bring him down. The irony left him both relieved and uneasy. Relieved because he had escaped. Uneasy because he suddenly understood that the woman hadn't simply been lucky enough to be in the right place. To spot an artificial cut in the middle of panic. To know exactly how to neutralize it, while his expensive technical team stood frozen in place. She had to understand this system so deeply that she was equal to, perhaps even better than, the very person who had sabotaged it. And that raised a new question, far colder than any of the questions he had given Roland the night before. Had her appearance truly been a coincidence? Or was she also some kind of piece in a game whose full board he still couldn't see? Desmond left the basement with a resolve as hard as iron. He had to uncover both truths at once, who had set the trap for him, and who the woman who had just saved him truly was. When her shift ended after night had fallen, Maya stepped out through the staff entrance at the street corner behind the tower, pulled her collar higher against the early night cold, and began the familiar journey home. A route she had taken more times than she could count. She caught 2 buses, changed lines at the old market, then walked a long stretch through streets that grew more worn down with every block, where the streetlights became fewer and farther apart, and the luxurious high-rises gave way to old apartment buildings with peeling paint. Her apartment was on the 3rd floor of a building, whose elevator had been broken for a long time, so she climbed the narrow stairs on foot, one hand gripping the icy metal railing, each step heavy after a long day. But when she slipped the key into the lock and pushed the door open, all the exhaustion on her face seemed to vanish in a single instant, because from inside the room, a tiny voice cried out for Mommy, and a 3-year-old girl with her hair tied crookedly came rushing out and wrapped both arms around her legs. Lena had stayed awake waiting for her mother to come home, just as she always did, even though Maya had told her over and over that she should go to sleep early. The babysitter, a kind neighbor from the apartment next door, stood up to say goodbye, telling Maya that Lena had been good the whole evening, had finished her dinner, and had only asked to wait for her mother a little longer. Maya thanked her, pressed a little money into her hand even though the woman tried to refuse it, then closed the door and lifted her daughter into her arms, though her back already ached with exhaustion. The apartment had only one small bedroom and a few old pieces of furniture gathered from places where other people had thrown them away, but it was clean and orderly, and the wall near the window was covered with Lena's crayon drawings, suns, houses with chimneys, and one picture of mother and daughter holding hands beneath a big tree. Lena chattered brightly, telling her mother about her day, about the stray cat she had seen outside the window, about the fairy tale the neighbor had read to her, and Maya sat down on the edge of the bed, listening to every word, nodding and smiling, letting that clear little voice wash away all the bitterness she had carried on her shoulders throughout the day. When Lena's eyes finally grew heavy with sleep, Maya tucked the blanket around her, brushed the loose strands of hair away from the little girl's forehead, and sat there in silence for a long while, watching her sleep in the dim yellow glow of the nightlight. It was in that quiet moment that her eyes came to rest on the small box on the bedside shelf, where she kept the blister packs of medicine and a worn stack of medical papers with frayed edges. Lena had been born with a heart that wasn't whole, a congenital defect in one of her valves that the doctors said would need surgery before she grew much older, or that small heart would grow more and more tired with the passing years. The operation cost so much money that on Maya's housekeeper wages, it felt as distant as a star in the sky, and every month she tried to save a little more, tucking it into the envelope hidden behind a picture frame, knowing full well that at that pace she would have to wait for years, while her little girl didn't have much time left to wait. That was exactly why a woman who had once had a brilliant career gritted her teeth and put on a faded uniform every day, lowered her head before people who looked down on her, swallowed every humiliation into her heart, just to hold on to a steady job and a roof over her child's head. Maya bent down and kissed Lena's forehead, whispering into the night that Mommy would find a way. that all her little girl had to do was get strong and keep drawing as many pictures as she wanted, and that her mother would take care of the rest. And inside that quiet voice was a promise she didn't yet know how she would keep, but one she would keep at any cost. Sitting in the still darkness beside her daughter's bed, Maya let her memory drift back to the life she had spent the past few years trying to bury, a life that anyone looking at her now would never believe had once belonged to the woman in this cleaning uniform. 4 years earlier, she hadn't been a nameless housekeeper. She had been one of the brightest materials engineers at a major industrial chemical corporation, the young woman her superiors had once called their precious gem, the person whose name appeared on multiple patents for heat-resistant materials, and who had solved engineering problems that had left an entire team of seasoned experts helpless. She had a private office overlooking the city, a salary that allowed her to dream about the future, and a home that had seemed complete beside the husband she trusted. But everything began to collapse on the day she discovered a serious flaw in the chemical processing system at one of the corporation's plants, a defect in the pipeline design that her calculations showed would sooner or later lead to a leak and place hundreds of workers in danger. She did exactly what an engineer's conscience told her to do, wrote a detailed report, sent warnings to the executive board, and requested that the production line be shut down for repairs before it was too late. But the people sitting high above saw only profit numbers and delivery deadlines. They brushed her warning aside, told her not to exaggerate the problem, and ordered the line to keep running. Then the thing she had feared happened exactly as she had predicted. A chemical leak at the plant, enormous damage, and a corporation facing the threat of investigation and crushing penalties. That should have been the moment when people realized she had been right. But instead, the leadership needed someone to take the blame, and they chose her. They twisted the records, buried her warning report, and built a story in which she was the negligent one who had approved the faulty design. Within a few weeks, the woman who had once been praised became someone the entire industry shunned, her name tied to a disaster she had, in truth, tried with all her strength to prevent. She was fired without a cent of severance, her dignity trampled underfoot, and the doors that had once stood wide open now slammed shut in her face. When she tried to speak out and reclaim the truth, she realized she was standing against a force far too large, a corporation willing to do anything to protect its reputation, even if that meant silencing one solitary voice. They sent her quiet warnings, reminding her that silence would be better for her, and she understood that if she continued, not only she, but the people she loved could be pulled into danger. In that whirlwind, the husband she had once trusted didn't stand by her. He couldn't bear the disgrace, couldn't bear the thought of starting over from nothing. And one day he left, abandoning her with a child in her womb and a world that had turned its back on her. Maya had buried her former self from that day on, putting away all her degrees, articles, and certificates in a box at the bottom of the closet, then stepping into a new life beneath the shadow of anonymity. She changed where she lived, took manual jobs that didn't require a background history, and learned how to become invisible, because she knew that as long as her real name remained forgotten, she and her daughter would remain safe. Hiding wasn't cowardice. It was the price she had accepted to protect the only precious thing left in her life. And that was why, even though her mind could read a classified system with perfect clarity in the middle of an emergency, she still quietly returned to her cleaning rag, so no one would know who the woman cleaning those rooms had once been. It took several days for Desmond's information network to peel back each layer of the cover Maya had worked so hard to build. But for a man who held enough connections in his hands to dig up any secret in the city, the truth finally appeared on his desk, in the form of a thin file. He read the woman's real name again and again, read about the patents that had once carried her name, about the scandal that had buried her career, and about the way she had been turned into a scapegoat for other people's failures. The more Desmond read, the more he felt a strange emotion rising inside his chest. Not pity, because he despised pity, but a slow burning anger at such blatant injustice. He had spent his whole life in a world where the strong trampled the weak, and if there was one single rule he worshipped amid all his cruelty, it was his contempt for those who used power to crush someone who had no way to fight back. Maya's story struck that exact nerve in him. He decided to go to her himself, not through an intermediary, not with a phone call, but by appearing in person at the door of her shabby apartment one evening, making her face turn pale when she opened it and recognized the most powerful man in the tower standing right on her threshold. Maya instinctively blocked the doorway, hiding the room behind her where her daughter was sleeping, and asked what he wanted in the guarded voice of an animal that had been wounded too many times. Desmond didn't speak in circles. He said he knew who she was, knew how brilliant an engineer she had once been, and knew what people had done to her. At those words, the blood seemed to drain from Maya's face, because the thing she had feared most for the past few years had just become real. Someone had torn open the cover she had sacrificed everything to keep. She took one step back, her voice trembling as she asked what he planned to do with what he knew, and whether he had been sent by her former corporation. Desmond saw the fear in her eyes and understood at once where it came from. He lowered his voice and said he hadn't come to threaten her, and that the people who had destroyed her had nothing to do with him. Then he went straight to the reason he had come. He told her the truth she didn't yet know, that the crack she had patched in the core chamber that day hadn't been an accident, but a deliberate act of sabotage aimed at him, a trap set by a hidden enemy who understood the system down to its bones. He said she was the only person he had ever met who could read the technical traces left at the scene, and he needed her help to find the one who had done it. Maya shook her head almost immediately. She said she had stopped being an engineer a long time ago, that she was only a housekeeper, and that getting involved in his affairs was the last thing she wanted. But what truly made her refuse wasn't humility. It was fear. Showing herself meant stepping out of the safe darkness where she had hidden for so long. It meant letting her name be spoken again, and once it was spoken, the people who had once wanted to silence her could find her, and find her daughter too. She told him she had things to lose that he couldn't understand, and asked him to forget that she had ever known anything at all. Desmond looked at her for a long while, reading the struggle in every word she spoke. And instead of forcing her the way he was used to forcing everyone else, he only placed a business card on the small table beside the door. He said he wouldn't make her do anything she didn't want to do. But if one day she changed her mind, or if one day she needed someone strong enough to stand between her and the people who wanted to hurt her, then she knew where to find him. Then he turned and walked away, leaving behind a woman standing frozen between two fears tearing at her from both sides. The fear of stepping into the light, and the fear that the darkness where she had been hiding was no longer safe either. The business card Desmond had left behind lay motionless on the table for several days, but it gave Maya no peace. Curiosity mixed with unease made her begin quietly paying attention to that man whenever she worked inside the tower, and little by little, through the whispered fragments of staff gossip, through the things she accidentally witnessed, she began to understand who Desmond Carrick truly was, behind the appearance of a wealthy hotel owner. She realized that the glittering tower was only the visible surface of an empire sunk far deeper beneath it, that the Carrick name was spoken with a blend of respect and fear across the docks, the casinos, and the commercial districts of half the city, and that the silent men standing guard in the corridors weren't merely ordinary hotel security, but loyal men ready to do whatever he commanded. One afternoon, while she was cleaning the hallway leading to the private meeting room on an upper floor, Maya accidentally became witness to a scene that made her understand that man more clearly than all the rumors combined. The meeting room door was slightly ajar, and inside, Desmond was seated across from a trembling man, in an expensive suit, a subordinate whom she vaguely knew as the manager of one of his business operations. Desmond's voice wasn't loud, but every word was so cold and sharp that it cut through the crack in the door and made Maya stop where she stood. He placed a stack of documents on the table, and said he knew the man had been skimming money from the workers under him for months, stealing from the meager wages of people who had no way to protect themselves, then falsifying the books to hide it. The man stammered, denied it, and offered one excuse after another. But Desmond only pushed the stack of papers toward him and said numbers didn't know how to lie. What Maya remembered forever wasn't the threat, but what Desmond said next. He said that in his world, people could fight for power, could strike at one another according to rules everyone understood. But there was one thing he would never forgive, and that was the strong, using their strength to choke the weak, the people who had nothing to shield themselves with. He said a man who dared to steal bread from the poor to enrich himself was the lowest kind of man he had ever met, lower even than the most reckless criminals, because he chose prey that couldn't bite back. Desmond rose to his feet, ordered the man to return every dollar he had taken, plus compensation for every harmed worker, and said that from that moment on, there was no longer any place for him in any business that carried Desmond's name. The way he handled it wasn't loud, and didn't require a single crude threat, but the cold decisiveness in every word made the man's face turn ashen, as he understood that the door of opportunity had slammed shut on him forever. Maya pressed herself into the corner of the wall, her heart pounding, both afraid of being caught listening and unable to leave. And in that moment, something in the way she saw this man changed. She had met too many powerful people in her life, and nearly all of them were like the people who had pushed her into the abyss. People willing to crush someone small in order to protect their own interests. But Desmond Carrick, though ruthless, though frightening, carried within him a kind of principle she hadn't expected, a boundary he would never cross. She suddenly understood why he had reacted that way when he read her story, why he had said the people who had hurt her were the kind of people he despised. For the first time since he had left the business card behind, Maya wondered whether this frightening man, in some strange way, might be the only person in the city who could understand the injustice she had been forced to bear. It was the scene she had accidentally witnessed in the meeting room that pushed Maya toward the decision she had wrestled with through many sleepless nights. She realized that an enemy sophisticated enough to set a trap for a man as powerful as Desmond wouldn't hesitate to crush someone as small as her if she kept hiding in fear, and that perhaps the only way to protect her daughter wasn't to remain invisible, but to stand beside the only person strong enough to shield her. The next morning, she called the number on the business card, and only a few hours later, Desmond had someone bring her to a sealed room, where he had stored everything that remained of the sabotaged pipe assembly, along with the system data records from the hours before the incident. When Maya stepped inside and saw it all laid out before her, something inside her came back to life. The engineer she had buried for so long, and the hands that had grown used to cleaning rags now moved across blueprints and metal samples, with a confidence she herself hadn't felt in years. She worked for hours without stopping, examining every cut in the pipe wall, comparing it against the pressure logs, following each number as if tracking the footprints of a predator. Desmond stood silently watching her, and this time he showed no impatience, because he understood that he was witnessing a mind working at a level money couldn't buy. At last, Maya looked up, and what she said made the air in the room grow heavy. She explained that whoever had made the crack didn't just understand the cooling system, but also knew the exact maintenance schedule, knew when the technical area would be empty, and knew the access codes to reach the core chamber without triggering the alarm. She said that information wasn't something an outsider could have, no matter how talented he was. It belonged only to a very small number of people in high positions inside Desmond's own organization. In other words, the saboteur hadn't broken in from the outside. He moved freely within the walls. He was someone Desmond trusted. Maya showed him a small detail she had found on the metal sample, a distinctive mark left behind by a very rare specialized cutting tool, the kind used only in high-level technical rooms, and said that if he found the person inside his organization who had access to that tool, along with all 3 pieces of knowledge, he would find the one who had betrayed him. Desmond listened to every word, his face darkening as the truth came into the open, because the thought of an insider worming his way through the closest circle around him disgusted him more than any attack from the outside ever could. But at the same time, he looked at the woman before him with a respect that grew deeper by the moment, because in one session, she had done what his entire team of experts hadn't managed to do in days. From that moment on, a strange understanding began to form between 2 people who seemed to come from completely different worlds. Maya was the one who saw what others missed inside numbers and lines, the mind that uncovered the truth piece by piece, while Desmond was the force that could turn those discoveries into action, the hand powerful enough to hunt and punish. She drew the path, and he was the one who walked it. They worked together in that sealed room until late into the night, and though neither of them said it aloud, both could feel that something was beginning to take shape between them, something beyond the relationship between an employer and a housekeeper, a trust built from the very wounds they both carried inside. When Maya finally went home in the darkness, she carried both worry and a strange feeling she hadn't known in a long time, the feeling that for the first time in years, she didn't have to stand alone against the whole world, and that someone was standing on her side, ready to face the darkness she hadn't dared to face by herself. Following the exact clue Maya had pointed out, Desmond began quietly narrowing down the people inside the organization who possessed all 3 things: knowledge of the system, access to the core chamber, and the ability to use that rare cutting tool, and he gave Maya the right to review the high-level personnel files so she could compare the technical traces against each person. She sat for hours in the sealed room, turning through one file after another, comparing the access logs to the technical area in the days before the incident with the list of authorized personnel, gradually eliminating one name at a time until only a very small number of suspects remained. Then she stopped at one file, and when her eyes moved across the attached photograph and the bold printed name beside it, her entire body seemed to turn to stone. The file in her hands trembled. Her breath caught in her throat, and the blood drained from her face in a single instant. That name was Roland Pike, the man she knew to be Desmond's most trusted right hand, the man who always stood silently behind him waiting for orders, the man the entire organization respected. But that wasn't what nearly made Maya collapse. She recognized that face, not from the corridors of Carrick Tower, but from a past she had buried for 4 long years. Roland Pike was the very man who had once stood in the conference room of the Chemical Corporation, the one who had distorted her report, buried the warning she had written, and built the story that turned her into the guilty one, who carried the blame for the failures of the entire leadership board. He had once been one of the heads of operations at that corporation, the man who had looked straight into her eyes and told her she should stay silent if she wanted to remain safe, the man whose cold voice still haunted her nightmares years later. She had never known where he had gone after her career collapsed, had never imagined fate could be cruel enough to place him right here, inside the very organization she was now helping, standing beside the only man who had reached a hand out to her. 2 pieces of her life that she had believed were separated by an abyss of time suddenly crashed into each other with a weight that left her dizzy. The man who had destroyed her years ago and the man betraying Desmond today were one and the same. Maya sat motionless in the sealed room, still clutching the file, while an entire storm of feeling surged inside her chest. The horror of facing the ghost of her past again, the anger at the injustice that had clung to her for so many years, and a cold fear as she suddenly realized something even more terrifying. If Roland Pike was working right here inside this tower, right beside Desmond, then it was very possible he had seen her. A housekeeper with her head lowered, wiping floors, could easily disappear into a nameless crowd. But the woman who had stepped into the core chamber in the middle of an emergency and saved the entire tower could not. She wondered whether he had recognized her face the way she had just recognized his, whether the name she had sacrificed everything to hide was still a secret at all. And an even darker thought slipped into her mind, that if a man who had once had no hesitation about destroying her entire life just to protect his own reputation now saw her becoming a threat who could expose his betrayal to Desmond, then he wouldn't stop at destroying her honor this time. Maya closed the file with trembling hands, trying to steady her breathing, but a dark premonition had already begun to rise inside her. She knew she was holding a truth with devastating power, a truth that could bring down her old enemy and save the man who had sheltered her. But she also understood that the moment she spoke that name aloud, she would officially step into a war from which there would be no way back. What she didn't know, what she only vaguely felt like a chill running down her spine, was whether she had recognized him first, or whether he had been silently aware of her for a long time. Maya's dark premonition came true sooner than she had imagined. And exactly as her most secret fear had warned her, Roland Pike was the one who had recognized her first. He had recognized the face of the woman who stepped out of the core chamber on that very first day. And while she was still groping through the pieces of the past, trying to put them together, he had already begun silently calculating how to remove the threat that carried her name before she had the chance to speak the thing he feared most. He understood that if Maya revealed to Desmond who she was and who he was, then not only would his betrayal be exposed, but the filthy past he had buried would rise to the surface as well. So he decided to strike first, and he chose a cruel blow that was exactly in his style, not loud violence, but quiet destruction, the same weapon he had once used to crush her years ago. One morning, while Maya was working on one of the upper floors, news spread throughout the tower that an important guest had reported an expensive piece of jewelry missing from his suite, a watch worth an entire fortune. Hotel security immediately began investigating, and in less than an hour, every arrow was pointing at Maya. People said she was the housekeeper assigned to that floor during the exact time the item disappeared, that her access card showed she had entered that room, and then, when the security team searched the employees' personal lockers, it was inside Maya's locker that they found the watch hidden beneath a layer of cleaning cloths. Maya went numb when she was called down to the security office and saw the evidence placed on the table in front of her. She stammered that she had never seen that watch before, that she hadn't taken it, but every piece of evidence had turned its back on her, and the eyes in the room looked at her with the familiar contempt she had tasted far too many times in her life. She understood at once what was happening. She understood that her access card had been used illegally by someone else, that the watch had been deliberately planted in her locker, that the entire incident was a trap, carefully set by a hand that knew exactly how to twist the truth, and she knew precisely whose hand it was. This was exactly how Roland Pike had always worked, turning an innocent person into a guilty one through cleverly arranged evidence, pushing the victim into a position where they couldn't defend themselves, using the very system to crush one lonely human being. The security manager announced that, according to policy, she would be suspended immediately, and the incident would be reported to the police, which meant she would not only lose her job but could also be arrested. And if she was arrested, then Lena, her tiny daughter waiting for her at home with her fragile heart, would have no one left to care for her. That thought terrified Maya more than anything else. Not fear for herself, but fear for her child. She tried to stay calm, asked to see the surveillance camera data, asked for an explanation, but the manager only shook his head and said everything was already clear and that she had no right to demand anything more. Standing in the middle of that room with accusations closing around her, Maya felt the ground beneath her feet collapse once again, exactly as it had 4 years earlier, and she realized with bitter clarity that her old enemy still hadn't let her go, that he had found her, and was repeating the same trick he had used to destroy her life once before. But this time, there was one difference Roland Pike had not anticipated. One thing, even Maya, in her panic, hadn't yet had time to think of. This time, she was no longer completely alone, because somewhere inside this tower was a man who had once told her that if one day she needed someone strong enough to stand between her and the people who wanted to hurt her, then she knew where to find him. News of the incident reached Desmond within minutes, because nothing happened inside his tower without his knowing it, and when he stepped into the security office with a face as cold as ice, the entire room immediately fell silent. He looked at the watch on the table, looked at the manager fumbling for words, then looked at Maya standing there with red-rimmed eyes while still trying to hold her head high, and with a single glance, he understood most of the story. He ordered everyone out, demanded to see all access records and surveillance footage from that floor, and when the technical team brought him the logs, it was the very perfection of the evidence against Maya that made him suspicious. Everything was too neat, too perfectly fitted, too convenient, like a performance staged by someone who wanted the audience to see only exactly what he had arranged. But before Desmond could trace the thread, another development occurred that made the situation far more dangerous. One of Roland's men, a man loyal to his faction inside the organization, realized that this woman had become far too valuable a piece on the board, and he decided to act in his own crude way. He managed to overpower Maya just as she left the security office, dragged her into an empty hallway in the service area, and called Desmond with a threat, saying that if he wanted this woman left in peace, he had to stop his investigation immediately and let the matter pass. The man thought that having Maya in his hands meant he had found Desmond's weakness, but that was the greatest mistake of his life. When Desmond received the call, his voice didn't rise even a little, and it was that absolute calm that made him truly frightening. He said only one sentence to the man, that he had just crossed the one line Desmond would never allow anyone to cross. Within minutes, Desmond's most loyal people arrived, surrounding the service area from every entrance, and Desmond himself appeared at the end of the hallway, each step echoing evenly over the tile floor like the ticking count of a sentence being handed down. The man, who had believed he held the upper hand, suddenly realized he had locked himself inside a trap with no way out, because every path of retreat had been blocked, and the eyes of the people surrounding him held no mercy at all. Desmond stepped forward, reached out, and pulled Maya behind him to shield her, then looked straight at the trembling man and told him that in all his life doing the things he did, he had forgiven many kinds of mistakes, but anyone who dared touch an innocent woman to bargain with him was not among them. He said this woman was under his protection from this moment on, and anyone who dared lay a hand on her would answer directly to him. The way he dealt with the man was quick, clean, and final. There was no need for showy brutality, only absolute power and an unforgiving coldness. And when it was over, the man had been stripped of every position, removed from the organization forever, and made to understand that he should disappear from the city if he still wanted peace. Maya stood behind Desmond, her heart still pounding after the panic, and when he turned back to look at her and make sure she was unharmed, she caught in the eyes of that ruthless man a tenderness she had never seen in him before. He spoke to her in a lower voice, telling her that she didn't have to be afraid anymore, that as long as she was here, no one would be able to hurt her. And in that moment, for the first time after so many years of living in constant fear, Maya felt something unfamiliar, something she had thought she had lost long ago, the feeling of someone standing in front of her to shield her. She understood that she had now truly stepped into the protection of the most powerful man in the city, but she also understood that the real enemy, the one who had set all these traps in motion, was still hiding and hadn't yet shown his face. Fate seemed unwilling to let Maya go, because just as she had escaped one trap and was standing at the threshold of exposing the enemy with Desmond, a phone call came in and made her whole world seem to collapse. It was a call from the neighbor who watched Lena, her voice frantic as she said the little girl had suddenly turned blue, was gasping for breath, and had gone limp, that she had called an ambulance, and they were taking her to the nearest hospital. In that moment, every thought of enemies, conspiracies, and truths that needed to be dragged into the light vanished from Maya's mind, leaving only the raw terror of a mother hearing that her child was in danger. She rushed out of the tower like someone whose soul had left her body, and when she reached the hospital, the doctors told her the thing she had feared for so many years, that Lena's small heart had grown too weak, that her condition had entered a critical stage, and that she needed surgery immediately, or she wouldn't survive. But the surgery the little girl needed was a complex procedure, requiring a leading specialist team and equipment this hospital didn't have, and the cost was an enormous number far beyond anything Maya could gather in an entire lifetime. Standing in the stark white hospital hallway, Maya felt as if she were being torn in two. She looked into the room where her tiny daughter was fighting for every breath, and she knew that to save her child, she needed a miracle she had no power to create. She thought of the envelope hidden behind the picture frame with the little money she had saved, thought of how it wasn't nearly enough, and for the first time in many years of forcing herself to be strong, that woman collapsed onto the waiting chair and broke down in helpless tears, her hands that had once saved an entire tower now trembling, unable to save the most precious thing in her life. It was in that darkest moment that she remembered the business card, remembered the words of the man who had told her that if she ever needed someone strong enough, she knew where to find him. With trembling hands, she dialed the number, and when Desmond's voice came through on the other end, all she could manage were the broken words of a desperate mother, saying that her daughter was dying, and she didn't know what to do. Desmond didn't ask much, didn't hesitate for even a second. He only told her to stay right where she was and wait. What happened afterward made Maya believe miracles were real. In an unbelievably short time, the entire machinery of Desmond's power was set in motion for one single purpose: to save one small life. He sent a medical helicopter to transfer Lena urgently to the finest specialty hospital in the city, where he had already called ahead and arranged for the best heart surgeon and an entire team to be waiting in the operating room. Every barrier of paperwork, money, and time that should have been able to steal the little girl's life was swept aside by just a few phone calls, and this time, the power he had always used to make people fear him was used for the gentlest thing it had ever served. When Maya arrived at the specialty hospital and saw her daughter being taken into surgery in the arms of the most capable people, she turned to Desmond standing quietly beside her, and she couldn't find a single word to describe the gratitude rising in her chest. He only looked at her and said softly that she had once saved many people that day in the core chamber without asking for anything, and now it was time for her to let someone else do something for her. Through the long hours of waiting outside the operating room, the ruthless man the whole city feared sat silently beside the praying mother, saying little, simply staying there, and that presence said more than any words of comfort ever could. And when the operating room door finally opened, with the news that the surgery had succeeded, that Lena's little heart had now been healed, Maya broke down crying once more, but this time they were the tears of someone who had just been given her whole world back. While Lena was slowly recovering in the quiet hospital room, Roland Pike understood that his time was running out, because he knew that the woman held a truth powerful enough to destroy him, and once Desmond had placed her under his protection, his silent traps no longer worked. He decided to risk one final gamble, and this time he didn't act alone, but joined hands with the man behind the entire conspiracy, Cormac Delaney, the rival gang boss who had always hungered to seize the container port deal and bring Desmond down. The two men knew that as long as Maya was alive and still able to speak, their plan was as good as ruined, so they made her their final target. Taking advantage of the moment, Maya left the hospital at night to go home and collect a few things for her daughter. They had men intercept her and take her to an abandoned warehouse in the old port district, where Cormac was already waiting. When Maya was brought into that dark warehouse, she found herself face to face with two figures from her past and present: Roland Pike, the man who had destroyed her life years ago, and Cormac Delaney, the one pulling the strings behind it all. Roland looked at her with a sinister smile and said she should have simply kept being a nameless cleaning woman and kept her mouth shut. that he had let her live the last time, and this time she had walked straight into death on her own. He said that once she disappeared, every secret would be buried forever, and no one would be able to prove anything. But what neither of those men expected was that they had underestimated the man they were fighting against. Desmond had ordered his people to protect Maya quietly from the moment he declared her under his protection, and the instant she was stopped on the road, word was sent back to him at once. While Maya was still being held inside the warehouse, Desmond's entire network had already traced her location, and he personally led his men there. The warehouse door burst open, and Desmond stepped inside with the bearing of a man who didn't know fear, his eyes sweeping across the room and stopping on Maya first to make sure she was still safe, then shifting to the two men standing there with a coldness that seemed to freeze the air. Cormac tried to appear calm, saying that Desmond had arrived too late and that he should sit down and negotiate if he still wanted this woman intact. But Desmond had no intention of negotiating. His men had surrounded the entire warehouse from outside, blocking every exit, and the lackeys Cormac and Roland had brought with them quickly realized they had been completely overpowered, both in number and in force. The confrontation unfolded with crushing speed. Desmond's men rushed in and subdued each henchman one by one, neutralizing them with disciplined training and iron resolve, and within moments, the entire situation had turned completely in his favor. Cormac struggled to find a way to escape, but every direction was cut off, while Roland backed slowly into a corner, his face draining of color as he realized that all his calculations had finally led him to this exact moment. Desmond walked straight to Maya, untied her with his own hands, and pulled her to her feet, asking if she was hurt anywhere. Only when she shook her head did he turn to face the two men who had dared to touch her. He looked at Roland, then at Cormac, and told them in a low voice, heavy as stone, that they had made the greatest mistake of all when they thought they could use this woman to threaten him, and that from the moment they laid a hand on her, their fate had already been sealed. He didn't need to shout. He didn't need to resort to theatrical brutality, because defeat was already written across the faces of those two men, as they understood they had lost, not only a fight, but the entire game they had believed they had firmly in their hands. Desmond ordered his men to take them both away, and as he helped Maya step out of the dark warehouse into the night beyond, she looked up at the man who had rushed into danger to save her, her heart swelling with an emotion she couldn't name, and she understood that this night marked the end of the days when she had to fight the darkness alone. That night, after Cormac and Roland had been taken away, and Maya had been brought back to safety, Desmond sat across from her in a quiet room and placed on the table the choice he believed was best for her. He said that even though those two men had been captured, the world he lived in was still filled with danger, and that Cormac Delaney's enemies, along with other hidden forces, could still try to take revenge through her. He offered to arrange for her and Lena to leave the city for someplace far away, a peaceful place where no one knew who she was, with a new identity, a new home, and enough money for her and her daughter to live a stable life without having to fear anything anymore. For someone who had spent 4 years living in constant dread, who had traded her career and her dignity just to become invisible, that offer should have been a dream. A life without fear, a safe roof over her child's head, a peace she had longed for across so many years. Maya sat in silence for a long while, looking out the window at the city lights stretching into the distance, and inside her heart was a struggle only she could fully understand. She thought of Lena sleeping peacefully in the hospital with her heart now healed, thought of the possibility that mother and daughter could live a life no longer haunted by darkness. But then she thought of something else too, something that had been smoldering inside her since the day she realized Roland Pike had remained free all these years. At last, Maya lifted her eyes to Desmond and refused his offer. She said that if she ran away now, no matter how safe she might be, she would still remain a fugitive forever, and her name would still be tied to a crime she had never committed. She said that for the past 4 years, she had lived like a shadow, lowering her head, keeping silent, accepting injustice as if it were her fate, and it was that very silence that had allowed someone like Roland to remain free, to keep having the chance to destroy other people the way he had destroyed her. She said she didn't want her daughter to grow up with a mother who had to live under a false identity and hide from her past. She wanted Lena to know that her mother had dared to stand up and face the truth, had dared to fight to reclaim justice for herself. Her voice trembled, but her eyes were steadier than they had ever been, as she said she was too tired of being invisible, that it was time for her to step out of the darkness, not to run away, but to take back her own life. And then she added something that made Desmond look at her with deeper respect than ever before. She said she wasn't doing this only for herself. She thought of all the other people out there who had also been trampled by the powerful, who had also been turned into scapegoats, who had also been forced to live in silence because no one stood on their side. And she wanted her story to become proof that the truth could still win in the end, that one small human being could still face an entire force and not be crushed. Desmond listened to her, and instead of trying to persuade her to change her mind the way he could have done with anyone else, he only nodded, because he understood that the woman before him had just shown a kind of courage he rarely witnessed even in his world filled with reckless men. He told her that if this was the path she had chosen, then she wouldn't have to walk it alone, that he would use everything he had to stand behind her until the truth was exposed and justice was carried out. In that moment, between two people from worlds that had once seemed as if they could never cross, a silent understanding took shape, and Maya knew that the final battle to reclaim her name and her dignity was about to begin. With renewed resolve and Desmond's backing behind her, Maya set to work doing what she did best, turning scattered pieces of data into a truth no one could deny. She spent days in the workroom, carefully gathering every piece of technical evidence she had decoded, from the mark left by the specialized cutting tool on the pipe assembly, to the access logs showing that Roland Pike had been present at matching times, to the data proving that the crack was artificial and not an accident. She arranged everything into a clear, airtight file, precise down to every detail, a file that, with her expertise, she knew no lawyer would be able to dismiss. But she didn't stop at the sabotage of the tower. During the investigation into Roland, Desmond's network helped her trace the past backward, and she recovered the very warning report she had written 4 years earlier, the report that had been buried to turn her into the guilty one. It turned out it had never been completely destroyed, but was still lying somewhere in old archives, and once it was brought into the light, it proved beyond denial that she had done her duty as an engineer, that the leadership had ignored her warning, and that Roland Pike was the one who had distorted the records to place the blame on her. When all that evidence was submitted to the authorities, along with the file on the sabotage, everything began to collapse for Roland and Cormac, in a way nothing could save. This time, it wasn't through fists or underworld power, but through the immovable weight of the truth itself. Investigators stepped in, following each thread Maya had untangled, and the full picture slowly emerged before the public. An organized act of sabotage, a betrayal from within, and behind it all, an entire guilty past belonging to men who had grown used to climbing upward through lies while trampling others beneath their feet. Cormac Delaney, the man who had pulled every string in order to seize the port deal, was exposed before the law along with his network of illegal business dealings. As for Roland Pike, the man who had tried twice to destroy Maya's life, this time there were no records left for him to twist. No isolated victim left for him to bully, only Roland himself standing face to face with everything he had done, and he had to pay the price according to the judgment of the law. But what mattered most to Maya wasn't the fall of her enemies. It was the moment her name was finally cleared. When the truth became public, the name once tied to a disaster was returned to innocence, and the people in the industry who had once turned their backs on her were forced to acknowledge that the woman they had cast aside had, in truth, been the only one trying to do the right thing from the beginning. After 4 years of living beneath the shadow of a crime that wasn't hers, Maya was finally given back her honor, given back the true self she had been forced to bury. Amid all of that, there was one thing Desmond had done quietly that Maya only learned about much later. The enormous cost of Lena's surgery, the debt Maya had believed she would have to carry for the rest of her life, had already been paid by him in silence, without a single word. When Maya discovered it and came to find him, she tried to refuse, saying she couldn't accept such a great kindness, that she would find a way to pay him back every dollar no matter how many years it took. But Desmond only shook his head, and he told her in a rare, gentle voice that some things didn't belong in the realm of debts and repayment. He said she had saved his tower, had saved his entire empire from collapse, and more importantly, she had reminded him that the power he held in his hands could be used for something better than spreading fear. He said that saving Lena's little heart was the most meaningful thing his money had ever done, and he didn't want her to see it as a debt, but as something one friend did for another friend. Maya stood there, her eyes blurring, and she understood that the man who had once shouted at her as if she were nothing but a ragged nobody had now become the strongest support she had ever had. The days that followed passed like a dream Maya had never dared to dream. Lena recovered day by day in a hospital room filled with sunlight. And when the little girl was finally strong enough to go home, for the first time after so many long months, color had returned to her cheeks, her breathing was steady, and her smile was as bright as the smile of any ordinary child. The moment Maya held her daughter in her arms, and felt that healthy heartbeat pulsing evenly beneath that small chest, she cried, but they were tears of a complete happiness she had thought she would never be allowed to touch. The daughter she had sacrificed everything to protect had been given life again, and the mother who had carried the whole world on her thin shoulders was finally allowed to breathe. As life slowly returned to peace, Maya found herself standing at a new crossroads. With her honor restored, the door back to the brilliant engineering career she had once known stood wide open before her, but she chose a different path, one that carried deeper meaning. She came to Desmond and shared with him an idea that had been kindling in her heart since her darkest days. The idea of building a program for talented people who had been crushed by life, people who had been treated unjustly, robbed of opportunity, and turned away by society simply because of circumstance or because of powers stronger than they were. She said she had once been one of them, had once stood at the bottom of the abyss and knew exactly what it felt like to be forgotten by the entire world, and she wanted to use her own story to reach out a hand to others, so no one would have to fight alone the way she once had. Desmond, the man who had once used power to spread fear, agreed without a moment of hesitation, and he promised to use his resources to turn that idea into reality, because he had learned from this woman herself that true strength didn't lie in the ability to make others bow their heads, but in the ability to help others stand again. And so, from the ashes of injustice and suffering, something good was born. Maya's story reminds us of something simple yet profound, that a person's true worth is never found in the clothes they wear, the work they do, or the social position they hold, but in the dignity they preserve even in the darkest circumstances. A cleaning woman in a faded uniform may carry within her an extraordinary mind and a heart more resilient than anyone could imagine, and it was her unbroken self-respect, together with the boundless love of a mother, that lifted her back up from the deepest edge of the abyss. Never be too quick to judge a person by outward appearances, because sometimes the people society overlooks the most are the ones carrying the brightest light inside them. If this story has touched your heart, please press the like button and share it with the people you love so we can spread kindness together. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so that every day you can hear more meaningful and captivating stories. How do you feel about Maya's story and her journey to reclaim her dignity? Please leave a comment sharing the feelings from deep within your heart, because we're always eager to listen to your voice. We wish all of you listening to this story abundant health, a joyful life, peace, and love filling every day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next stories.